Poor girl refuses to accept handouts. The millionaire then hands her a card with just one word on it: trust. And what happens 7 days later? No one was prepared. She was selling flowers in front of one of Manhattan's most luxurious buildings, her hands soiled with dirt, her apron torn, and her eyes heavy with fatigue. On that freezing morning, a black Rolls-Royce stopped right in front of her. The driver got out, opened the door, and a man in an impeccable navy blue suit, sunglasses, and an arrogant look walked up to her. He looked at the wilted flowers and sneered. "Aren't you ashamed to occupy the sidewalk with this trash?" he snapped. The crowd stopped. She stood still, clutching her basket of daisies tightly. He pulled $100 bill from his pocket and waved it in the air as if feeding a pet. "Take it, buy something decent, or go study." She didn't extend her hand. She just stared at him with dignity. It was then that he put away the money and, with a slow gesture, handed her a white card with a single word engraved in gold: trust. 7 days later, that same girl entered that building through the front door, and no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what happened. A week after the public humiliation, the same millionaire was sitting in the 44th floor conference room, waiting for an anonymous investor who had purchased a significant portion of his company's shares. When the door opened, everyone stood, except him, who remained with his back turned, still typing on his cell phone. But the silence that filled the room finally made him look up. There she was, no flowers, no apron, just an elegant white dress, her hair tied back in a bun, and in her hands, the same card with the word trust. He paled. No one understood, but she simply walked to the table, placed the card in front of him, and said with a half smile on her lips, "I didn't accept your handout, but I accepted your proposal." What had happened in the previous days, and how that florist became the owner of part of his empire, was something he could never have predicted, and what she would say next would change everything forever. Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. The morning after the card, the flowers were more wilted than ever. The cold had punished her hands during the early hours, and people's gazes seemed even more indifferent, as if she had become invisible after that scene. But it wasn't invisibility, it was collective embarrassment. Many had witnessed the moment the man in the tallest building in the city handed her money as if he were feeding an animal at the zoo, and she refused with her eyes, with silence, with the dignity of someone who had swallowed too much shame in life to bow again. But the white card remained there, folded in the pocket of her worn coat, like a nagging doubt. Trust. That was all. No phone. Number. No name. No explanation. How could she trust something so vague, coming from someone so cruel? Even so, something in her hesitated to throw the card away. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about her. The next day, she didn't go to the square. Instead, she sat in the 32nd Street Public Library, reading everything she could find about the Carl Emerson Group, the name emblazoned in gold letters on the millionaire's building. She discovered he was one of the city's most aggressive entrepreneurs, known for buying bankrupt companies, ruthlessly restructuring them, and profiting like a predator. But there was something else, too. For the past 2 years, he had been quietly investing in startups and social causes through a subsidiary called Horizons. No one knew exactly why. On the morning of the third day, she decided. She tucked the card in her pocket, tied up her hair, changed her clothes, and headed to the building. She didn't bring flowers. She brought questions. The receptionist tried to stop her, but she just showed her card. The woman did a double take, swallowed hard, and made a quick call. Within a minute, an assistant appeared, young, hurried, too polite to be ordinary. He asked for you to be taken to the 44th floor. Elevator. Silence. Heart racing. The mirror on the elevator ceiling reflected someone even she no longer recognized, and when the doors opened, she entered a world of glass, polished concrete, and hostile silence. He was there, standing, watching the city from behind. When he turned, a subtle smile appeared. "You came." She nodded. You knew I would come. He shook his head. I hoped so. Because the world needs people like you inside, not outside. He pointed to a side table where a contract, a computer, and a white flower in a glass vase sat. Shall we begin? She didn't understand. Not entirely, but she sat and began. For 7 days she learned, observed, read, studied, worked, and saw that there was something behind that. Man's arrogant facade, something no one else could see. But at the same time she also realized he hadn't changed. He was the same man who had humiliated her in public, the same man who had given her a card as if playing with fate. And it was then that she understood. He didn't want to help her. He wanted to test her, and that she couldn't forgive so easily. Not yet. But she wasn't here to demand justice. She was here to deserve it. And when the 8th day arrived, she appeared no longer as a florist, but as a partner. Only no one knew that yet, and the way she revealed it in would forever mark his name. She grew up in a forgotten corner of rural Tennessee, where the dust seemed permanent and the days repeated like tired reruns. The house was too small for so much pain and broken promises. Her mother left when she was 7, leaving only a crumpled note and a handkerchief smelling of cheap perfume. Her father was half silence, half anger. He worked as a mechanic during the day and drank at night. Sometimes he cried in secret, but he never had the courage to apologize for the screams. The only thing he did with love was tend the flowers in their small yard, an irony only she would realize years later. When she turned 12, she began selling homemade cookies at nearby churches. At 14, she bussed tables at a cafe. At 16, she washed cars and helped elderly people with groceries. But deep inside, he carried a dream no one could see: to study. She didn't want luxury, she just wanted to learn, to grow, to do something that honored the pain she'd experienced. Her first scholarship came at 17. It was for a community business school. She took 2 buses a day to attend classes, and when she returned at night, she read borrowed books until she fell asleep with her head on them. Her father died the following winter, and the flower garden was nothing but dry land. She sold everything left of her house for a nominal sum and moved to New York with a backpack on her back, $48 in her pocket, and a letter from the local college that said, approved. She rented a room with 3 strangers and began working as a flower vendor on the sidewalk, not by choice, but because no one would hire someone without experience, decent clothes, or recommendations. But there was one detail no one knew. She kept a notebook, a worn notebook, where she wrote down everything she heard from executives passing by on the street, from conversations in Siesen, Manhattan cafes, from the economics books she secretly read in bookstores. Her knowledge grew silently, invisibly, like roots under the concrete. One day she overheard 2 men talking about preferred stock and wrote down every term. Then he studied every word. After that, he began observing the Carl Emerson Group building from afar. Not because I dreamed of working there, but because there was something about that place that called to her. Maybe it was the way the suits ignored the salespeople, as if they were part of the decor. Or maybe it was the fact that she had once heard from her father that the building had been founded by a kind man named Frank Emerson, who died mysteriously and was replaced by an arrogant heir. She didn't know it yet, but that name Frank would return like a shadow in the future. And perhaps that's why, that day she received the card, something went silent inside her. Something that whispered, it's not just about flowers. She had already been rejected too much to care about pride. But there was something in that gesture, cruel, yes, but also enigmatic, that made her keep the card. Because maybe that word, trust, was all she needed to hear after a lifetime of no one believing in her. The night before the humiliation, on the 44th floor of the mirrored building, a conversation dripped with sarcasm and arrogance between 3 men in perfectly tailored suits. They drank expensive whiskey while watching, through the panoramic windows, the tiny human specks shuffling along the sidewalks below. One of them, the youngest with an easy smile and an empty soul, pointed to the flower girl with his elbow propped on the glass. Want to bet she'll take the first bill someone waves? The second laughed disdainfully. Those poor girls who feign dignity always bend for money. It's biology. But it was the third, Carl Emerson himself, who delivered the verdict. He crossed his arms, stared at the scene and said, "Let's do a social test." Nothing. Illegal, just revealing. It was typical of him, hiding cruelty beneath layers of supposed philosophy. This wasn't the first time he'd used someone as a pawn in his games. Carl was obsessed with human behavior, but only when it amused him. The deal was simple. He would go downstairs and offer the girl money. If she accepted, she'd win the bet, and the others would pay for a very expensive dinner. If she refused, well, she'd still have her 10 seconds of glory in front of the city, he said, adjusting his cuffs as if preparing for a duel. They laughed, all of them, like children playing ant-swatter with their polished shoes. No one there imagined that this social test would become the first thread to be pulled from a past Carl, buried with each passing day with greater luxury and silence. But that afternoon, he stepped off the elevator like a rehearsed actor. He passed through the lobby without looking anyone in the eye, crossed the revolving door, and walked to the sidewalk where she stood, kneeling among pots and broken branches. The rest you already know, the superior look, the $100 bill, the still crowd. But what no one saw was the moment she didn't just refuse the money. She looked at him. A direct, clear look, neither imploring nor accusing. And that, in that second, unsettled something in Carl. He hadn't expected it. For a moment he hesitated, and then, as if to reassert control of the game, he handed over the card with "Trust" engraved in gold, and walked back into the building without looking back. But when he climbed back to the 44th floor, his two friends were left open-mouthed. She didn't take the money. Carl just gave a cold smile and said, "No, but she'll come back. They always do." What he didn't know, and could never have predicted, was that she wouldn't come back to ask. She'd come back to take. And that simple gesture, the card given out of vanity, would become the gateway to a truth that would change everything. The bet had been made, but the prize wouldn't be his. The elevator rose silently to the 44th floor, the sound of the numbers rising like the rhythm of her heart, beating between fear and determination. Stepping out, she was greeted by a space that resembled a modern art gallery more than a company. Marble, glass, minimalist lines, and absolute silence. No flowers, no human gestures, just the echo of the receptionist's heels as she led her to a meeting room. "He's on his way," the woman whispered, before disappearing as if she too were part of the architecture. The girl stood there alone before a long mirrored table. There was a white flower in a vase in the center of the table, a camellia. She recognized it. It was the same species her father had cultivated with such care. That disconcerted her. Was it coincidence or provocation? Before she could elaborate, the door opened with a metallic click, and he entered. Carl Emerson. Impeccable suit, neutral expression, direct gaze. But there was something different about him. Less arrogance, more calculation. He didn't smile, didn't apologize. He simply walked to the chair at the end and sat down, as if she were another item on his agenda. "You came," he said, his voice low and firm. She nodded. "You asked me to trust you." He rested his elbows on the table. "And you still have the card?" She took it from her pocket and placed it on the glass. He stared at the word, as if he'd forgotten what he'd written. "Great, then let's enforce it." She frowned. "Enforce what exactly?" He studied her for a few seconds and then slid her a small tablet. On it, a series of spreadsheets, charts, and contracts. "I need someone who can see what my executives can't. Someone from the outside. Someone who can see where the human error lies behind the numbers. Someone without a filter." She hesitated. "And why me?" Carl crossed his arms. "Because you refused $100 in front of an audience. Because you endured being belittled and didn't. Bow. Because you saw my vanity, too, and didn't smile." She narrowed her eyes. It sounded less like a compliment and more like an experiment. "You want to use me as your external conscience." He didn't deny it. "I want you to tell me when I'm being blind. I want you to tell me the truth, even if it hurts." She looked at the tablet, then back at him. "And what do I get for that?" he answered without hesitation. The chance to turn what they made you into a tool, the chance to enter. And then he stood, leaving the room. You have 7 days. After that, either you go back to the flowers, or sit at this table as someone who belongs. She stood there, alone, staring at the word on the card on the glass. Trust. And for the first time, she thought that maybe trust was the first step to mastery, because she no longer wanted to just enter that world. She wanted to change it from within, starting with him. The 5th day began with her entering the building's main lobby, wearing an old overcoat, but with her head held high. She no longer carried flowers, nor the tiredness in her eyes. Her steps were silent, but resolute. When the elevator took her back to the 44th floor, she found a different atmosphere. The 3 executives who had made the dirty bet were meeting with Carl in the conference room. She hesitated at the door, but he subtly nodded for her to enter. No word of welcome, no smile. It was the silent battlefield of the corporate world, and she knew it. As soon as she sat down, she heard one of them whisper to the other, loud enough to hurt. The florist is now an analyst. All that's left is to serve the coffee. The others laughed with lazy disguise. Carl didn't react. He continued shuffling through the documents, as if it were normal to have a street vendor sitting among men who made millions. Throughout the meeting, she kept her eyes alert. She noticed inconsistencies in the reports, conflicts of interest ignored, fragilities in the projections, and at the end, when Carl asked if anyone had any comments, she took a deep breath and raised her hand. Silence was instantaneous. One of the executives rolled his eyes. Carl, however, gestured for her to speak, and she did. Clearly, precisely, courageously. She pointed out a miscalculation in the investment forecasts that jeopardized one of the company's funds. She detailed how it would affect not only profits, but also the jobs of the small businesses involved. Carl listened in silence. The others listened with contempt. When she finished, one of them said, "And where did you learn that from, in a vase of daisies?" The room erupted in dry laughter, and that was when Carl finally spoke up. He stood slowly, walked to the glass wall, and said, without looking at anyone, "She saw something you all overlooked, and if she's wrong, at least she had the courage to speak up. What would you do, other than laugh?" Silence was immediate, but the damage had already been done. As they left the room, she heard the muffled comments. "Street girl trying to teach a lesson. It's just his whim, she'll disappear soon." At lunchtime, she tried to sit in the company's internal cafeteria, but was completely ignored. Not a glance, not a word, just the sound of conversations continuing as if she didn't exist. When she tried to ask one of the secretaries a question, the woman simply replied, "You shouldn't be here." On the 6th day, upon arriving at the building, her badge didn't work. She was barred. From the reception desk, one of the security guards said there was a credential review in progress. She called Carl's extension. No one answered. She waited. 2 hours, 3, until he finally came down. He wore sunglasses, his usual coat, and a neutral expression. "Did something happen?" she asked. He simply replied, "Everything's fine. Trust me." And he got back in the elevator without another word. It was the first time she felt real anger, because now she understood. It wasn't just about betting against her. It was about controlling how much she resisted, and humiliating her not with screams but with silence. And that she wouldn't allow anymore. Not for one more day. On the morning of the 7th day, she didn't go to the building. She didn't dress to impress, didn't care about the stairs or the card. She went to the park on 52nd Street, sat under the shade of an ancient oak tree, and opened the notebook she'd carried since Tennessee. Each page was a fragment of her story. Notes from borrowed books, quotes from grumpy clients, company names, mistakes she'd witnessed in the informal market, unfinished ideas, and thoughts on human behavior that no one would ever read. But that day, she wrote nothing. She simply skimmed each word and understood finally what Carl had done. He wasn't testing her intelligence. He was testing her patience, her resilience, her limits. She was, for him, an open equation. an experiment. And if there was one thing she'd learned throughout her life, it was that those who thrive on testing others rarely know their own limits. As the sun began to set, she closed the notebook, got up, and walked to the building. She didn't use her name tag. She didn't wait for permission. She entered through the back door, climbed the emergency stairs, and reached the 44th floor, breathing steadily and unhurriedly. She knocked on Carl's office door. He was alone, looking at graphs on a large screen. When he saw her, he started to get up, but she stopped him with a gesture. "I know everything," she said calmly, "about the bet, about the whispers, about the blocked badge." He closed his laptop slowly. "It was necessary." She laughed humorlessly. "Necessary for what? To measure my obedience? To see how long I could tolerate being invisible?" Carl leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "No. To see if you were different." She moved closer. "And you? Different from what? A well-dressed predator." The silence settled between them like a glass wall. "I let you in because I saw something in you," he said, "but I needed to be sure you wouldn't break at the first push." She inclined her head slightly. "You didn't let me. I came in. And you only tested me because you're used to having the world at your feet. But I didn't come from the ground, I came from beneath it." He seemed to swallow hard. For the first time, his superior posture gave way to a trace of discomfort. "I didn't give you money. I gave you a choice," he murmured. "No. You gave me a riddle, and I solved it. But not for you. For me." She pulled the card from her pocket and placed it on the table. It was crumpled, worn, the gold ink already faded. "Trust. You wrote this thinking it was an invitation. But for me, it was a challenge." Carl stared at her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now you have a problem." He raised his eyebrows. "What problem?" "You created something you can no longer control." And he left, without waiting for an answer, leaving only the card on the table. Alone, Carl picked it up, ran his fingers over the nearly faded word, and understood for the first time that the tables had turned. And he didn't know the rules anymore. That night, Carl Emerson didn't sleep. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't the noise of the numbers that disturbed him, nor the markets nor his competitors. It was the silence of that sentence. "You've created something you can no longer control." He paced his luxurious Madison Avenue penthouse apartment, but he couldn't escape the unease, a strange mix of irritation, curiosity, and something he would never admit. Fear. Fear of having lost control. Fear of not having foreseen it. Fear of not knowing who, exactly, she was. And it was on that impulse that he typed her name into the company's system. At first, nothing. No file, no history, no full last name. Just Evelyn. Then he accessed deeper records. Cross-referenced data. He scoured talent pools, public databases, donor lists, records of old social projects that his company had silenced years ago to pay off moral debts. And there, among the digitized papers of a small foundation called Winter Flower, he saw the photo. A little girl with dark eyes holding a camellia seedling in her hands, and just below the name of the project's donor, Frank Emerson, his own father. Carl froze. The image looked old, maybe 15 or 20 years old. But the eyes, they were the same. He went back to the database, obsessed now. He searched Tennessee records. He found her name, Evelyn McConnell, daughter of Rebecca McConnelland, according to the documents, with a history of community support linked to reforestation projects and urban gardens, precisely the area Frank, his father, had championed until he was removed from the group's presidency. Carl felt his stomach churn. There was something there, a coincidence too big to ignore. And then, on impulse, he looked up the board minutes from the time Frank Emerson was ousted. He read the documents as if reviving a ghost. Frank had been accused of mismanagement, of diverting funds to money-losing social projects. But he knew, deep down he always knew, that it was all a setup, that his father had been silenced by voices seeking profit at any cost. And among the signatures on the petition calling for Frank's departure, one in particular stung like a dagger. His. Carl had signed. Young, ambitious, blind. He had been convinced by the directors that his father was weakening the company. And now, years later, a girl, the daughter of the woman Frank had helped so much, returned as an echo of that mistake. He sat, his hands on his face, his eyes fixed on nothing. Everything made sense now. Her gaze, her refusal of the money, her unshakable dignity, the knowledge that seemed to come from another time. Evelyn wasn't there by chance. She was the mirror of the father he had betrayed. She was the loose thread of the story he had tried to erase. But it wasn't revenge she sought. It was truth. Silent justice. Carl knew she had discovered everything, and if he didn't know, he sensed it. And it consumed him. For the first time in years, he wasn't the predator. He was the target. And perhaps, deservedly so. The next day, she didn't show up at the building. No message, no note, no explanation. Just absence. Her usual seat to the left of the meeting room felt empty, yet strangely present. It was like a mark on the leather of an expensive armchair, invisible to the unintentional, but uncomfortable to those who always sat there. Carl tried to convince himself it was just a passing refusal, that she would return. They always did. But time passed, hours, days, and Evelyn disappeared as if she'd never existed. No badge, no bank card, no digital location. Not even the public library contacts knew about her. It ate at Carl from the inside out. He, accustomed to tracking anyone down in seconds, suddenly found himself powerless in the face of the disappearance of a girl with no last name in the company records. But the discomfort wasn't just practical, it was personal. He missed her presence, the way she looked at him fearlessly, the way she challenged him silently, the way she asked uncomfortable questions that not even her advisors dared ask. He missed her raw honesty, that untrained yet razor-sharp intelligence, and that was unacceptable, because Carl didn't miss anyone. Ever. And now, he found himself staring at the empty chair at the end of the room, waiting for her to enter with her old tablet and sharp eyes. He tried to distract himself. He threw himself into mergers, trips, investor meetings, but everything sounded plastic. The executives' voices seemed like hollow echoes, the decisions automated, and everything he did suddenly seemed small. So he began revisiting the places she mentioned. He went to the 32nd Street Library, where she read in secret. He passed by the flower shops in Brooklyn. He even secretly visited the small foundation that still stood in Tennessee, the same one in the old photo with Frank Emerson. There he found a neglected garden, but in the center of it, a single camellia bloomed. Beside the plant, a rusty plaque, for those who would rather cultivate than destroy. Carl stood there for over an hour, no cell phone, no watch, just sitting on the stone bench, before that solitary flower. And in that silence he felt an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. Because now he understood. Evelyn hadn't disappeared. Out of pride. She'd disappeared because she'd accomplished what she came to do, and he hadn't known how to grasp the gift while he had it. She'd withdrawn with the dignity of someone who knew her worth, and that left him exposed, because deep down, he realized, he'd always thought he could buy anything, but you can't buy an entire soul, and much less the silence of someone who's been hurt by contempt. Now, he was the one waiting anxiously for a sign from her, but perhaps that sign would never come again. The 9th day after Evelyn's disappearance dawned, with an autumn storm washing over the streets of Manhattan, but inside the Carl Emerson Group building, the real storm was digital. During the early hours of the morning, an anonymous video began to spread like wildfire. The title was straightforward: Social Test or Public Humiliation? You decide. And in the video, recorded by an external security camera, Carl appeared to be offering a $100 bill to Evelyn, the florist, in front of a crowd. The image was clear, his tone was condescending, her gaze was firm, her refusal was evident. The card, handed over as if it were a consolation prize, and in the background, the muffled laughter of executives watching from afar. In less than 3 hours, the video surpassed 1 million views. Comments poured in from all corners. Is this the man who claims to support social causes? The woman refused money with more dignity than many CEOs have in their lives. He used her. As an experiment, and now he's silent? Carl's communications team tried to control the crisis, but it was too late. Hashtags like corporate humiliation and florist of dignity dominated Twitter. Influencers began commenting. Political figures weighed in. The Horizons Foundation, the company's social work arm, received a barrage of criticism. A journalist from The Atlantic published an editorial saying, maybe the florist turned down $100, but what she gained was the respect of the world. And for Carl, this was more than an image crisis. It was a brutal mirror, because no one knew except him who she really was. No one knew that Evelyn carried within her the living memory of Frank Emerson, the father he had betrayed. No one knew that she had sat at that table, spoken truths that executives hid, and pointed out flaws that he himself ignored out of vanity. But the world knew he had tried to demean her, and that was enough. In the company corridors, whispers began. The same. People who had mocked Evelyn now exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of the executives resigned silently. The other began working remotely, for health reasons. Investors demanded explanations. Emergency meetings were called. Carl attended them all, but in every instance he was silent, dejected, different. It wasn't fear of financial collapse. It was something else. It was shame. For the first time in years, he saw the reflections of the empire he'd built, and they trembled under the eyes of someone he'd tried to erase. When the media discovered that the Winterflower Foundation building had been funded with funds from Frank Emerson, the public connected the dots. Is the florist part of the family he tried to erase? They asked on social media. But Evelyn remained silent. She didn't show up. She didn't comment. She didn't demand anything. And that hurt more than any speech. Carl couldn't buy her silence, and that silence now screamed louder than any scandal. That night, Emerson climbed alone to the rooftop of the building where he had built his empire. The city pulsed below like a living organism, full of lights and noises that had once thrilled him, but now only echoed the emptiness that had settled within him. The air was cold, and for the first time in years he felt it. He felt the icy wind on his bones, felt the night's humidity touch his skin, because his armor, the one made of vanity, status, and self-sufficiency, was beginning to crack. He was falling apart, and no one knew it but him. By that point in his life, Carl had already endured every kind of crisis, financial, legal, political. But none had brought him to his knees like the absence of a florist, or rather of a woman who dared to face him with dignity. And the more he thought, the more he understood that the problem wasn't that she had disappeared. It was that he had become someone she wanted to disappear from. This revelation devastated him. In the days that followed, Carl isolated himself. He cancelled meetings. He delegated everything. He delved into his father's old files. He read the letters Frank had written before he was removed, letters he'd never had the courage to open. He discovered plans for social projects his father dreamed of implementing, but which had been shelved by the board Carl supported. In one of them, Frank said, "The future of a company is not measured solely by profits, but by how many lives it touches with respect." That tore at what remained of his armor. Carl finally understood that his entire rise was built not only on effort, but on silencing. He was the architect of a functional but emotionally rotten empire. And perhaps Evelyn had come as the reminder life sends when it's too late. But he decided it wouldn't be. Not yet. He spent weeks reviving his own values. He fired the executives involved in the video. He restructured the board. He revived all the social projects that had been buried since Frank's time. He invested in free education for young people from poor neighborhoods. But he didn't release anything to the press. He wasn't seeking public forgiveness. He wanted to earn her silence. During a meeting with investors, one of them asked, "Is this an image strategy?" Carl replied, "It's regret." And silence fell over the room like thunder. That night, he returned to the flower shop where he'd met her. There was no one selling flowers there anymore, but the spot remained. The sidewalk still bore the marks of the wooden basket she'd used. He bent down, placed his hand on the ground, and for the first time wept in public. No screams, no despair. Just the silent tears of someone who finally understood that arrogance was never synonymous with strength. True strength was knowing when to admit failure. And Carl Emerson was willing to rebuild, not his empire, but himself, stone by stone, word by word, if she were still willing to see. It was on a grey November morning that the reunion took place. There was no announcement, no advance notice, no prepared itinerary. Just a simple invitation discreetly left at the reception of the Carl Emerson Group building, a recycled paper envelope, handwritten with the name Evelyn. Inside, a sheet of paper with an address and the phrase, "Come only if you want. I've moved, and I hope you're still willing to look." No signature, no logo, just that firm, humble handwriting that, for once, didn't carry the weight of authority. Evelyn held the envelope for long, minutes before deciding. I couldn't tell if it was an emotional trap, an empty apology, or a last-ditch attempt at control, but something inside her, perhaps the same instinct that made her keep the trust card, whispered that she should go. The address led to an old wooden house in the suburbs, restored with simplicity and care. Upon entering, she was surprised by the scent of fresh camellias. There were flowers in pots, books on horticulture, social projects spread out on the table, and in the corner of the room, a greenhouse under construction. Carl was there. He was wearing jeans and a simple shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in dirt. He saw her and stopped what he was doing, without smiling, without theatrics. "You came." She nodded slowly. "What's all this?" He took a deep breath. "It's my father's foundation. I'm reopening it, with his name and yours." She frowned. "My name?" He walked to the table and handed her a small brochure with the new institution's logo. The Evelyn and Frank Institute, to replant what the ego has torn out. She said nothing. She just read the sentence, touched the paper, looked at it, and saw there not the arrogant man who had humiliated her with a $100 bill, but someone who chose to change even when no one else was looking. "You changed me," he said, "not because of the scandal, not because of the video, but because you remained silent, and let me hear what I avoided hearing." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment. "I didn't. Come out of curiosity, Carl. I came to see if your change was real, because if it were just an act, I would leave without looking back." He approached cautiously, as if afraid of breaking something invisible between them. "I don't want to convince you. I want to invite you, to be a part of this, to really plant." She fell silent. She walked to the greenhouse. She touched the metal structures. Then she turned to him. "You understand that this isn't about including me, but about recognizing that you should never have excluded me." He nodded. "I know. And I understand that maybe it still isn't enough." Their reunion had no hug, no kiss, no movie-like happy ending. There was truth. There was a long look, and he had the silent feeling that perhaps there began something stronger than forgiveness. Respect. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She just stayed. And that, in that moment, was more than he ever dreamed he deserved. The sun was already setting when Evelyn walked alone. Through the foundation's newly renovated garden. The golden light touched the camellia petals as if to seal, with silence, everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be. Carl watched her from afar, without pressing, without approaching. Unlike the man who once acted like he owned the world. Now he just waited, but not for an answer, for truth. Evelyn stopped in front of a flower bed where new seedlings were being planted by volunteers. Among them were young people from marginalized neighborhoods, women who had once also sold flowers on the streets, men who had left shelters, invisible people, people like she had been. She took a deep breath and then returned to him, firm, serene. "You called me to decide," she said, "but my decision is not about you. It's about what I want to leave in the world." He listened to her silently, without moving. "You asked me to trust. I trusted. Me. And that brought me here. What you did afterward was yours to thank. Not mine. It's not my forgiveness you need, Carl. It's yours. He nodded slightly, his eyes watery but restrained. Are you staying? He asked softly. Evelyn smirked. I'm not staying with you, if that's what you're asking. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because what we build with trauma is born crooked. He looked away, swallowing hard. But that doesn't mean we won't meet again somewhere. In the struggle, in the work, in the roots that will grow here. She extended her hand. And he, as if holding something precious, shook it respectfully. Without intruding, without holding too tightly, she continued, What you gave me that day with that card wasn't an invitation. It was a mirror, and what I saw made me discover that I can be so much more than anyone expected of me. Carl had no words, only eyes of gratitude. So, yes, I accept to walk alongside this cause, but what existed between us, personally, ends here, because I need to be whole, and for that, I need to move on. She gently released his hand. Then she took the same card he had given her, already faded, and placed it between the bricks of the flower bed where a new seedling had just been planted. Trust, she said, like a whisper to her own soul, but never without remembering where we came from. She turned and walked slowly through the garden as the sky turned orange and the world seemed at peace for the first time. And Carl alone understood that sometimes the greatest proof of love someone can give is choosing to leave with dignity. The morning wind blew gently through the streets of Brooklyn, carrying with it the scent of fresh flowers. On a quiet corner, now revitalized, stood a new flower shop. The facade was simple, painted in soft shades of green and cream, with a wooden sign hanging from gold chains. No grandiose name, no trademark, just a symbol. A hand-carved white camellia surrounded by intertwined branches. The window displayed carefully crafted arrangements, but what caught the most attention was the small sign attached to the glass in the lower right corner. On it, in delicate faded letters, was just one word: trust. No one knew for sure who the flower shop owner was. Some said she was a former street vendor. Others swore they'd seen her alongside big businessmen. But that one day she decided to disappear and start over. Some saw her as a symbol of silent resistance, of unsellable dignity. And every day, when she opened her doors, she greeted each customer with the same serene, firm smile that once defied power. Meanwhile, in a glass-enclosed building in downtown Manhattan, Carl Emerson sat in his office before a vase containing a single white flower. Sometimes he smiled as he looked at her. Sometimes he simply closed his eyes, as if offering thanks without needing to say anything. They never met again. They never spoke again. But in two distinct parts of the city, something grew that words cannot convey: respect. And perhaps that was all that needed to blossom. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? I really want to know your opinion. Don't forget to leave the like. This really helps bring stories like this to more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, sign up now. Every week there are new exciting stories that touch the soul. And take advantage, the next video is appearing here on the screen, and I guarantee you, it will surprise you even more. Click and stay with us.